Remember, folks, it ain't simple being cool, it's cool being simple. Pirate Radio is up next on Rediscovered Movies. Hello, welcome to a new episode of Rediscovered Movies. I'm your host, Nomfanelo Malloy. So, the film that I'll be focusing today is Pirate Radio, aka The Boat That Rocked, for those of you that are tuning in outside of North America. So, the movie is written and directed by Richard Curtis, who's known for films such as Love Actually and About Time. The film stars it stars Philip Seymour Hoffman, Bill Nighy, and Nick Frost. So the film focuses on a fictional pirate radio station in 1966 called Radio Rock and its crew of DJs that broadcast rock and pop music in UK from a ship in the North Sea as the British government attempts to shut them down. So the film was released in theaters in the UK on April 1st, 2009. In North America, it was released in theaters on November 3rd, 2009. So the film, in terms of box office, made over $37.4 million worldwide against a $50 million budget. Domestically, it opened at number 11 with 2.9 million. It was beaten by films including 2012, Precious, and Michael Jackson's This Is It. In terms of critical reception, on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 59% critic score, where they say the good cast and rollicking soundtrack eventually drown when this comic homage to pirate radio loses its quippy steam. The audience gave it 71%. At the time of this recording, the film is available on demand, so check your local provider. Let's go on to first discoveries. So, I believe I saw the trailers for this movie in theaters at the time, the same year. I don't remember what movie I was watching at the time, but I recall seeing the trailers for this movie in theaters. And it had the original title, The Boat That Rocked. And I thought, oh, that looks like fun. Maybe I'll check it out. So I ended up not checking out at the time, but then when it came to this podcast, I decided, you know what, I'll check out this movie. So I rented it at the Cineplex store, which that platform had some technical issues, but was able to watch the film regardless afterwards when it got fixed. And I thought this movie, even though it looked like fun, it was quite boring. Probably because of the pacing. I think how like it was structured and the plot essentially. But I would say on a positive note, the subject matter in terms of a radio station broadcasting from a boat is interesting. And it's quite fascinating that with this movie, I guess, was inspired by those real life pirate radio stations in UK during the 60s. So I felt like that would have been interesting to see as a documentary as opposed to a narrative movie, but here we are. So, highlights, yeah, let's go on with the subject matter because, yeah, it's interesting that at the time, I guess in the 60s, the UK government did not like rock and roll music because I guess it was popular at the time, and I guess the government doesn't like rock and music. I'm not quite sure why. But essentially, with these pirate radio stations, they're essentially saying like F the system and like we're gonna play the rock music for the people, which we see in the movie that the fans really enjoyed. And going off on that note, the film explores this whole censorship versus freedom, where the government is pro censorship. Essentially, they want music that is not rock, but if I were to guess, probably classical music is something that they lean towards, or music that's more modest. And you saw in the movie the government, they pretty much admit that, yeah, we're going to make up laws just to shut them down, or to try to find loopholes around to shut the radio stations down. And Quentin mentions at one point in the movie that the government loathes people that are free, which it is true in real life, unfortunately. So also to highlight is that it shows life for DJs on the boat. Essentially, they have fun playing rock music for the fans, which they clearly enjoy and they enjoy too, while they're also hanging out by either playing games like they did at one point in the first act, or they also too will be either butting heads or poking fun at each other. And also too, like they would always invite women on the boat to have sex with, but we'll talk about that part in the low light section. So yeah, it was interesting to see like the day in the life of a DJ on the boat. The music itself with the selections are fine. Like I'm not familiar with a lot of the songs, but some of them I was quite familiar with, and it does definitely feel nostalgic. And if you're fans of music from the '60s at the time, you'll enjoy the soundtrack for this movie. The cast, I felt was solid. I thought everyone did a good job, but for me, the standout performance was Philip Seymour Hoffman as the Count. Because here, it was just nice to see him doing a comedic role. Because usually he's known for the more dramatic works. So I thought, yeah, he did a great job of his performance. Where essentially he's the only American in the movie. And the rivalry between the Count and Gavin is hilarious because clearly they're both prominent radio DJs, and it displays their egos. But they do eventually get along. But it was just nice to see them butting heads throughout this movie. And another highlight that I thought was funny is that. I guess before or after sex, they have this thing where they'll have tea. I'm not sure like if it was like a cultural thing or just as a gag to poke fun of themselves, but I just thought it was hilarious. Now let's get on to the lowlights section. So I want to talk about the title. So the original title for this movie is The Boat That Rocked, which I felt the title is fine. But when it was released in North America, it got changed to Pirate Radio, which I'm wondering why change it to Pirate Radio. Because I think I have a trivia fun fact for that one, but I just felt they should have stuck with the original title. But I would say that, as an alternative title, they could have named it Radio Rock after the radio station that our group is based in. I want to talk about the plot. So the film focuses on Carl, who is sent by his mother, played by Emma Thompson, to go stay at the boat, Radio Rock, essentially. And it seems like initially he was sent there as a punishment because he was getting into trouble. But it, I guess, turns out that he's trying to get to know his dad, which initially we believe it's Quentin because he says in the movie that, oh, I love your mom and all that stuff. But then turns out it was Bob. So, and I felt with that particular plot point didn't really go anywhere because after when Carl tells Bob this, like Bob is just in shock and doesn't really say anything. But then later on, when the boat's sinking, he helps Bob, and then that's pretty much it. I don't know. Yeah, because I felt like maybe Bob could have acknowledged, like, yeah, I didn't know about this, but I want to get to know you sort of deal, but that didn't happen. And I wonder too, like with Carl, like if this is supposed to be punishment, it's not the ideal place to get punished on. Maybe because like you're in a boat in the middle of nowhere and you're forced to be stuck in a confined space. But I just wondered too, does he want to be a DJ? Does he want to be in the radio, I guess, industry? I don't know because he seems to enjoy himself hanging out on the boat as the film goes on, but beyond that, I mean, I don't know because I mean he does have like a romantic subplot, but other than that, I just wonder what was his goal in this movie. I don't know. Um, yes, there were some moments in this movie that were cringy. So the main one I would say is when Dave, played by Nick Frost, he gets Carl to have sex with Desiree in the dark. Why? Because it seems like he is self conscious about his weight, even though Desiree assures him, like, oh, that she loves the way he is, essentially. And then for some reason, he gets Carl to, like, hey, pretend to be me and have sex with this lady. But then luckily, like, she turned the light on and then spotted Carl, which obviously does not end well. I just wondered why. Like, was that scene necessary? Why? And the women I felt in this movie were not written well. They were used more as props because they're essentially there, most of them, to either be in the background or just to have sex with the male characters. And there's no substance to it because I guess the female lead in this movie is Felicity, where throughout the movie she pretty much says, I'm a lesbian because she's the only female worker on the boat because they're not allowed to have, I guess, women there all the time except for certain times in the movie. But yeah, that was just weird. And Eleanor, I think she's one of the fans of the show. She marries Simon, one of the employees there. But the thing is, she marries Simon to be with Gavin, which I'm like, that doesn't make sense because if she wants to be with Gavin, go be with Gavin. Like, why, like, go through these different hurdles just to be with Gavin? It does not make sense. And lastly, as a low light, there were some moments where it looked like it has some green screen, particularly when the Count and Gavin are climbing up the boat during their rivalry. I just felt like it felt a bit off. All right, let's get on to trivia, some fun facts. So here are some ones that I found via IMDb. So this movie was loosely based on Radio Caroline, a popular pirate radio ship with a similar history and style. It was executive producer, writer, and director Richard Curtis' intention to weave a fictional story around the many pirate stations of that era rather than base the story on fact, I guess, which is fine. Although purely fictional, this movie references many of the actual events surrounding pirate radio. Namely, like the pirate radio ship, the Ross Revenge, the movie ship is red with the station's name in white paint on the deck. Radio Caroline ship, the Mi Amigo, sank, complete with fleeing DJs unable to save the ship's vast record collection, and as in this movie's finale, its extremely high mast rose out of the sea, where it stayed for many months. Also, a DJ married on a pirate radio ship, as Simon does in the movie. Additionally, the DJs are seemingly composites of popular radio stations of the time, such as Tony Blackburn, also unlucky in love in his early days, a la Simon Swafford, when his rocky marriage became apparent in his radio show, and the wacky Kenny Everett has traits similar to Angus Knutsford, Dave Lee Travis, whispering Bob Harris, American DJ Emperor Roscoe, and Johnny Walker are also seemingly portrayed in this movie. The real pirate radio station Radio Caroline lent a great deal of the equipment seen on the ship, although the turntables and broadcasting equipment is predominantly from the late 60s to early 70s. It wasn't used on Radio Caroline until 1980s. Interesting. The ship used for filming was the MV Timor Challenger, and much filming, day and night scenes, was done in Portland Harbor, the venue for the 2012 Olympic sailing near Weymouth. The red paint scheme was based on that of the MV Ross Revenge, which was the Radio Caroline pirate ship from 1983 to 1991, is nowadays maintained as a museum by volunteer enthusiasts who assisted with several aspects of the movie, including loaning many of the broadcasting and ship props. Interesting. Although the stuffy, pompous, reactionary Sir Alistair Dormandy appears to be a synthesis of Tory politicians from this era, the 1967 Marine Broadcasting Offences Act outlawing pirate radio was introduced under Harold Wilson's Labour government, and the person chiefly responsible for its intro was the famous socialist politician Tony Benn, who was Postmaster General from 1964 to 1966. And lastly, Hans Zimmer wrote the score, which consists of only one 6-minute cue during the finale without being credited as composer. He did this as favor to working title films with whom he has worked during the beginning of his career in the 80s. The score track is listed in the closing credits among the numerous songs used as Sink or Swim, and Zimmer listed in the fine print as the writer of this particular song, along with Lauren Belf. Interesting fun facts. So, lastly, should this movie be rediscovered? And for me, I say no, because it just did not work for me as a narrative film. I thought like the comedy was hit and miss, more misses than hits, because it was cringe for the most part. And yeah, aspects of it have not aged well. I would have honestly rather see a documentary or a docuseries of this subject matter instead. So that pretty much concludes this episode of the podcast. So you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Linktree at Nomfanelo. You can find the podcast on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Linktree at RD Movies Pod. On Spotify, you can answer the feature question, poll, and rate the podcast. On Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review and rate the podcast. You could submit questions, comments, and suggestions by email, which is rediscoveredmovies@gmail.com, or you could send a voice message on Spotify for podcasters at RD Movies Pod to be featured on the after show, which will air after the season finale. And all the links to the stuff will be available in the description. So I want to say thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of the podcast, and I'll catch you on the next one.